Right. Did everybody have a chance or feel like they had a chance to contribute to the iteration retro issue that we created? Saw some feedback from everybody. There's no, I guess, set agenda or schedule for this, so we can kind of freestyle it. If does anybody have a part of their issue that they want to talk about and discuss? We don't need to read through all the feedback. Does anybody want to jump in and share their thoughts? And I'll take notes as we go through it. Don't everybody talk at once.
Just finding the issue. Sorry.
I can share. So we're all looking at the same
Sorry,
thing.
I missed what you said, Craig.
We're just talking about the iteration issue, and I don't have like a set agenda what we need to talk about. We don't need to read through every one since people have had time to read it asynchronously. Does anybody have any thoughts or common themes that they saw? Anything they want to discuss about their MRs or somebody else's MRs?
I think that I will start. I think that a lot of times these issues, not breaking MR, starts by follow-up comments and realizing after you started working on an issue that you have to add something more. And sometimes this one more thing can be twice as large as the rest of the MR. And so yeah, splitting an MR beforehand. So I have some examples. For example, those examples are simple. The response is you should have broken the MR from the start. Everything is simple. But there are cases where after you start the MR, you get a feedback, or you realize that, okay, I have to also do something more and something more. And at that point, I think that that's the point where MRs must be split, and that's the more difficult point. And sometimes it also depends on wanting to release in the same release, I think. So, you think that you say that if I split the MR, maybe I won't make it both MRs in the same release. But I think that we should split MRs. We should keep the MVC rule always true. I don't know if everyone agrees.
I agree. I think I have this quite often that you're getting feedback like pretty late in the phase. So you tidied everything up, and the last one coming in points something out, and then you realize, well, this takes quite long, or it's a significant change to the MR. So at that stage, asking yourself whether or not this is actually needed for the MR attend, or if you maybe just merge it without that and create another MR. I think that's a great thing to do. I sometimes end up with having to juggle multiple MRs because of that, and they are dependent on each other. But so far that has been working out. The MR dependency feature is quite nice, where you can actually mark an MR as a dependency of another. And then what I typically do is you start with one branch, and then you split another MR out, and that's sort of dependent. And I configure the MR such that it's pointing to that feature branch instead of master, so you get to review those changes separately. And then only when the dependent one is merged, you change those branches. That has been working out quite fine.
Can you describe that again? So if you have a dependent MR, you point that MR at the feature branch so you can keep them separately? Is that what you said?
Yeah, so you basically want to be able to review those two MRs separately, even though they're dependent on each other. And then when you let both point to master, then the second one has both change sets, basically, and you don't want that. You want, so you can point to the feature branch instead until that is merged, and mark it as a dependency so it doesn't get accidentally merged. And then you can review that separately, or even in parallel to the other.
That's a good idea. All right, what else?
Yeah, I think the one thing that kind of stood out to me too when I was looking is, this is something I had talked about with Andres the other day, but a few of the MRs I have, you know, in order to get to the point where I want to start implementing the feature, there's some other maybe change I need to make in preparation for implementing that feature. And really that is great to have in a separate MR. It's very self-contained, doesn't kind of muddy the water of the main change. So I think like any kind of preparation work for I need to be able to do this before I can get to the real work is something I should always kind of look for right off the bat.
So even if the change that you have isn't really being used because it's a prep for another change, I think it makes total sense to do that separately, right? Previously, I always thought that you have to sort of ship something that is used right from the start, but I don't think that's really the case.
Right, yeah, that's how I saw it. I think as long as, you know, there's an explanation of why you're making that change, I think that's clear.
Cool. Pat had a couple of good comments in his feedback, so I will list them here. What the hell happened there? Sorry, I'll have to edit the video now. I'm not sure what happened on that last paste. So yeah, lesson here is not to get too absorbed in the change without thinking about the iteration aspect of it. And then non-trivial improvements suggested during the review process should be addressed in a follow-up issue if possible. And I think both Andreas and Giannis mentioned that in the conversation too. I thought those were great comments in the retro.
So what makes it possible to delay a non-trivial improvement? I mean, there are things or comments you can get that are marked as minor or non-blocking. And for those, I think it's pretty clear, and you can and perhaps should make use of that if it's like a larger change, push them out, right? Can there also be major comments that you can push out, or how would you do that?
Well, in this example, it was related to the tests. It was basically moving the helpers that I had written into like a shared helper file, which then I had to go back and change a bunch of other tests that weren't really related to that change. So that's pretty clear cut that probably that cleanup doesn't need to happen in that particular MR to me anyways. I think in general, those kind of feedback often comes like, you know, maybe moving things, restructuring things a little bit, maybe some code cleanup. Like the code is working, the solution is maybe, you know, working solution as is, but maybe it's not. You know, it could be iterated on to improve the code quality. That is not necessarily something that needs to happen in the same MR to me, because it might require like significant restructuring and then, you know, maybe changing tests and things, and then it sort of just pushes everything out a few days. If it's like functionality related, then yeah, I don't think that can really be pushed out. Like it needs to be done then. But even sometimes too, there will be suggestions of, oh, maybe there's these kind of errors we're not checking for. Maybe there's these, you know, edge cases or something. Even those kind of, like, I created follow-ups for those, like, oh, I had better error handling around this because, you know, so even that is something that could maybe be done as a separate.
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking about like how do you convince a maintainer, having like major comments or things that are perceived as a major problem. Is there a way to argue that, well, I can still leave it like this, and I'll make sure I'll commit myself to like working on the next MR immediately to get that fixed? Is there room to argue like this?
I think that the larger problem is that sometimes you cannot follow up. You have to have an MR before this MR. So this is even more major. So creating a follow-up that addresses an edge case, okay, we can discuss about it. But a lot of the time, those are core things that you realize that if you want to properly split the MRs, you have to pause this MR, even though it's almost ready, go start a new one that will predate this MR, work on that, and you have to introduce it and bring in the same reviewers, have it pass through all the review process and merge, and then come back to this one and work on it. I don't know if you agree. And this is a little bit larger, and that means that this MR will stop dead because it's not like it's not a follow-up; it's a prequel. It's
Mm-hmm.
But in that case, you're still breaking it down into separate MRs, right?
Yeah. We're talking about MRs that can be broken because there may be an MR that everything is interdependent. So you cannot, for example, I don't know, introduce something in one MR and I don't know. Let's say something that breaks the UI. Maybe you have to do it all at once. I don't know. Yeah.
I think another way I would answer Andreas' question is just create the separate issue or MR, the work in progress MR, and say, I'll follow up on that over here and take the conversation to the other one, rather than, if you just say, yeah, I'll follow up on it later, they probably won't believe or trust that it's going to happen, maybe. So maybe creating that follow-up issue or MR would help just move that conversation to the other one.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I think you should be targeting a state that allows you to merge the MR without having to worry about the quality, or without having to really go through the follow-ups immediately, right? Because I mean, that's kind of the goal as well, that you split something out and you can follow up immediately, but you can also do that later. So you shouldn't split something out that sort of says, well, you have to do this right away because the other MR is shit, basically, right? So the quality should be like, I can merge this and I can then stop working on that topic, and I don't have to worry about the follow-up anymore, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So there was a question that came up in other iteration retros that I've seen. Like sometimes MRs are bundled because it's just easier, right? Each individual item is so small that it would be a significant amount of extra work to break them up into smaller MRs. Has anybody encountered that with the MRs that they're working on, and that's why they ended up bundling a couple of small changes together?
Yeah, 100%. That's true. But yeah, that's something we can avoid. So I think that this is actionable. So we can easily start and creating more MRs, I think. So this is the easy use case.
Sometimes happens with refactorings where you're basically done, but then I could change this and refactor that. But you could also ship it that way and then do the refactoring separately.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's tough because the change, I guess, the idea of iteration is that we want to do small changes, but it's hard to know, like sometimes when I see MRs that are small, but they don't necessarily really deliver anything, which to me, I guess that doesn't really seem, I guess the MR is small, it's easy to review, but that's not necessarily like iterative because it's not implementing really anything that's useful. Like I feel like iteration is still delivering small incremental changes that are useful, that you can see like a change come out of that. So that's the part I feel like that about iteration that's tough, because it's pretty easy to just arbitrarily like break down an MR into smaller MRs and say I'm going to deliver this code in pieces, but you're not delivering functionality. And I think even like refactoring, even saying like, oh, that can be a separate change, and that's something like I know that I could do that probably to make my MR smaller and have more of them, I suppose. But there's even an argument, a lot of people would say like you shouldn't really refactor code unless you're already in changing the code. Like refactoring should not be a separate MR. It should be part of the change that you're making. So I feel like that the idea of iteration is a little at odds with some of those other concepts. So yeah, I don't know. It's tough for me to know. Like reviewing these, I can say, oh, I can see where I could have broken these down more, but I'm not necessarily sure that it would have made, like maybe from our perspective of what we call iteration, it would have made more sense. But I'm not sure it would have made more sense from like my perspective of writing the code to do that.
Yeah, I'm torn on the refactorings. I mean, I get the idea that you should do the refactoring while you're working on it, because otherwise you have a context switch again. You have to think back into the code and then do the refactoring. But so it should be in a timely manner somehow. That doesn't mean you have to ship it in one MR or in separate MRs, right? You could still have your feature change in one MR and then immediately follow up with the refactoring in a separate one. And sometimes I find that clearer because as an example, I don't know, you basically, you have a feature change that repeats something you already have, and it repeats that twice or 3 times or so. And then, well, you want to dry it up later, right? So instead of repeating yourself, you extract that and you remove the repetition. That's the refactoring. But then if you put everything into one change, it looks like you were changing the code that was already there. And you're adding the second and third call of that. You can follow what I'm clumsily trying to explain. But instead, if you were adding, like, if you were just adding the repetitions, like I'm doing this second time and a third time, and then you discuss the feature change, and then when that is accepted, you go in and say like, well, now I draw it up, and then you discuss the refactoring. And sometimes I feel that's clearer from what the intent is behind the MR.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I stopped screen sharing so you could stop watching me type. But yeah, thanks for that feedback.
And on the other point, I think from delivering functionality, I think a prime example for splitting MRs without really delivering functionality is, sometimes we do that quite often, is extracting the database migration into its own MR. So you have a feature, you have backend code, you have one MR for that, and then before you start working on that, you basically have an MR with the database migration. And I feel that's sometimes a bit unfortunate because while you work on the backend code, you might discover things that sort of inform your database schema. So you have to go back and like change the migration. I don't really see value in doing that differently. Do you have a different take on that, or do you see value in like splitting database migrations?
I've done that. I have done that in my own changes just because I've seen other people do that. And I think like, oh, this is an easy way to kind of break up the MR. But yeah, does it actually make sense to do that? Not necessarily. You know, that's the thing, I think, is you see patterns of how kind of things are broken down and you're like, oh, this, yeah, okay, I can do this. But then you're just sort of cargo coding what everyone else is doing. You're not really thinking about, does it make sense to do that? So, you know, that's where it's tough, I think, because it is a difficult topic to figure out how to break things down in a way that makes sense. And sometimes changes like just naturally sort of become big because there isn't a clear boundary to break it down, but then that seems like sort of frowned upon. So then you're sort of stuck of like, well, how can I create an arbitrary boundary around something so I can have more MRs to ship kind of thing.
Also, migrations, database migrations, you want to bundle together the migrations that if something is not working properly and you have to revert the MR, you want to revert all the migrations together most of the time. So you add a new attribute and you add a foreign key and you add a constraint. Let's say that those are 3 different migrations, and maybe you have also a data migration there, and the data migration fails. This happens, and we have to revert. If we revert the data migration, we don't want the trigger, the constraint with validate false to be there. I think we want to revert everything and reintroduce everything, because the problem may be in the data migration or the problem may be in anywhere. We may in the end decide not to do it like that. So I cannot see most of the migrations. I think that you cannot split them.
I caught that sometimes we're doing that because of the review process, because you know there is a database review and you want to have the migrations for that, and then there's a separate backend review. And so I heard sometimes motivation for splitting the database migration is actually the process. So you send the database migration first, and you get that done, and then you don't have to worry about that anymore, and then you do the backend stuff. But the more I think about that, I think it's unfortunate, because when you're doing the database review, for example, you want to look at the migration, but oftentimes you also want to understand like how does the application work with that table, or what queries are we actually doing? Like
exactly.
How can you even tell which indexes are missing maybe when you don't have the backend code? So.
A lot of times we have MRs with no description, no context, and you have to follow back to the issue and figure out there is another MR and understand how the code works. Also, this is not always working, because not all migrations are post migrations. Maybe you have to have the code there. So it's not like maybe if you introduce the migration, so it's not always just add a new attribute. Sometimes you have to have the code and the migration there. Am I right?
Mm-hmm.
Because having the migration without the code, why do that? Or it may even break things. So you need the code there to be sure that it will be deployed in the same release.
Mm-hmm. I was just actually working on an example for that. It was for product analytics, where we said, well, the original MR grew too big, and now it got split into, well, this is the database side and this is the backend side, and then you end up having to refer to the other MR saying like, well, this is the query that we're going to make, and this is why we need to index here, or stuff like that. So maybe that's something we should discourage at some point, or
yeah, but this is an easily split MR. So because it had the code for the database, the code that introduced the syncing, and the code for the UI. Am I right? So you can say that the consumption part, why they have the consumption part in the same MR as the introduction of the database changes, because the consumption, I mean the UI, where people go to the dashboard, etc. But yeah, but once more, sometimes our decisions, for example, for indexes depend on the queries. So if you don't have the queries, you don't know what index to add.
I don't know that the product analytics is the best example of iteration, period, right? I mean, it's a huge ongoing proof of concept that was one massive MR and is now, is it up to 2 now, or are there more? It seems like an anti-pattern for iteration, to be honest.
Did you
It
get
is
feedback on the office hours call for that?
Did they
I
talk
think
about
that this
that?
is a new product, Mark. It's like, you know, when you introduce a new product and you have this huge first commit where you introduce everything. It's like that.
I don't know that I agree with that, but I get what you're saying.
Yeah, there was an interesting point from the iteration office hours that kind of ties into this a little bit, I think, is there was a discussion around one of the teams was working on implementing something where they had kind of designed out this whole plan of features and MRs that they were going to build, and there was an API, and kind of Sid was saying that he would prefer to do more of like an API last, because you can't really change the API once it's until, you know, you need to know like what API you're going to build, so that should really be like one of the last things that you should deliver. And I think that kind of ties into this conversation too, because that's like the same as saying like, well, we have one MR for the database, one MR for the backend, one MR for the front end. Like a change should be like a vertical slice of the app to me, not like, how can you write the backend when you don't know what the front end, or how can you write the database when you don't know what the backend is going to be? So like have 3 separate MRs for that. Like it doesn't, you're not looking at a holistic problem solving. But I think also people do that because the database reviews sometimes create a lot of churn, and there's a lot of rules around that people don't understand that well. So they like just want to isolate that because they're, you know, they know they're going to probably have to change it sometimes 2 or 3 times until they kind of get like the magical formula for their migration that gets approved.
Yeah. But also the database review can change the queries. So you cannot have, so for example, for Finder MRs, where you have the Finder, you could say that I will introduce something and then have the Finder also. But you need them there because the change may be in the index, but the change may also be in the query or maybe in the approach. Maybe if we decide that you cannot do it like that, let's say that we had to introduce namespaces. I will go back to this recursive query that I really don't like. And let's say that somebody had this very nice MR that introduced namespaces by itself. Namespaces, if you check the recursive nature of namespaces, is not that huge of a deal when you introduce it. But if you start thinking that we are going to use this in all our queries and it's going to slow down all our queries, then you may decide that I want a different approach and I want a different approach in the database, and I want a different approach in the queries also. And so it may change the model in the end, because you may not go with a recursive thing, you may go with the denormalized that has the paths, and then it changes everything. Or you may go without all those models that we have that are have hierarchies, you know, object hierarchies. You may decide not going with a type, and then everything changes everywhere. But yeah, thankfully, yeah.
Actually, did you say API last as a pattern? The
Yeah,
only pattern I know is API first, where you basically work on the contract before you do anything, and then everything else is some implementation detail that can change.
Yeah, so
Right, that was discussion, yeah.
Yeah, what Sid said in there was exposing the API at the start means that we're locked into that design. API should be stable, and APIs are hard to change. So yeah, I do remember that conversation. I think, I'm not sure I agree with that, right? APIs can change. If you document them, like saying like, this is not a major release, we are working on this, it's a work in progress, however you would label it to customers, or you could feature flag it so that customers can't consume it while you're iterating on it, you know, however you need to protect it. So I'm not necessarily in agreement with what was said during iteration office hours. And I think, you know, Sid has said in the past, strong beliefs held loosely. So if you could potentially push back on that. In the iteration office hours, I didn't agree with their comments about I can't remember who made the comment, but something about they did too much planning in advance. There was one team that said our first iteration was this plan, and they had kind of a plan of the next several iterations they were working on. And I think it's okay to kind of do that milestone planning and how you think things are going to lay out, because you can start considering dependencies and what, just talking out loud can generate more work. Like, oh, I didn't think about that. It's like, even this conversation has generated ideas. So I kind of disagreed with what Marin and Sid said about not spending so much time planning up front. I think documenting ideas is a good idea. So I disagreed with that statement as well.
I think they did later in the call say he kind of changed the wording to not be API last, but that the API maybe just needs to be experimental, or like all APIs should be marked as experimental until we know they're ready for consumption. But I don't know, I agree with that. And it must be like, I have been in that position of like writing an API and not really knowing like what we're trying to implement, and you're trying to come up with like a good API design, but you don't understand enough of the details of like what it's trying to do. Then you sort of get locked into this design, start writing the code underneath, and you realize all these things you didn't think about, and now your API is broken. Or you have to immediately do like a V2 because you did the work too early.
Yeah, I think that the idea of API first and what we say interface first for classes, so the class interface first or the API first, is a little bit different on the fact that you should define how it defines how things will work. It defines the business logic. So it's like define how this thing will work and then go to the details. But yeah, if we introduce, for example, something that 2 million users will use, then it's a problem. So if you're tied to that, but if the idea is that what are the core API mechanisms, what's the interface? So what is this feature is going to provide? I think that, yeah, API first or interface first gives the business requirements for this service, product, feature, call it however you want.
Yep. All right. I need to leave in 10 minutes. So are there any follow-up items or any action items that anybody thought of that we can start applying as a team as we're going through iteration and MR creation?
Maybe not so much for us, but perhaps we can find examples for splits where the database migration is separate and sort of see if that makes sense. And if not, then maybe raise that as a broader issue and discuss that in a broader sense.
So find some examples where it didn't make sense to split out the migration because the code changes is too dependent on the migration and it made it more difficult.
Yep.
Okay. Just want to make sure I captured that correctly. Okay. And thanks for all the great examples in the issue. It's clear that you all put a lot of thought into it. So I think some of the common themes and comments I've heard here and in other iteration retros that I've either watched or attended, right? There is no golden rule, right? When you're working on an MR, it's not going to jump out and go, hey, it's obvious you should break this out. One rule that I had at previous jobs is, and the velocity was more based on issues rather than MR, but I always questioned when the title for the issue had the word "and" in it, because that's usually an indicator that you are doing one thing and you're doing another. So I would always point that out, and it got to be annoying. Like team members would go, "Oh, Craig's going to say 'and' because it's in the title." So That was one rule I had with my teams. It is
That's
okay.
true.
Sorry?
Yeah, that's true. That's a nice rule.
Simple rule, right? Other teams mention, if it's a super simple couple of changes and it's going to be significantly more work to break it out, it's okay to ship that small MR that may have been breakable, but it's too much work to do multiple MRs. So that was something other teams agreed that was okay if it's small enough. And then, yeah, and make sure you look for comments in the MR that could be broken out into a follow-up rather than being additive, right? Just turning into a snowball of this went from a simple MR to holy crap, there's all kinds of new things were added to it. So that's all I had.
I just found a comment from Nick from yesterday. He ran some statistics on the repository, and 99% of commits come in at below 1,200 changes. I suppose line changes. Sort of saying that if you're in the 1%, ask yourself, do you need to be in the 1%?
That's very Nick, the style.
Yeah.
Do you want to be that guy? But yeah, even 1,000 lines is a lot, I think. So most of the time, so I think that the rule of the MVC, so keep MRs actionable and keep MRs as close to an MVC as possible, is sometimes we cannot do that in the database because we have also all of those research issues in MRs. But when you have actionable things to do, features, if you can keep them actionable in MVCs, that's a nice rule.
Say that again, Janos.
Keep the MRs actionable, so they are, you have a very clear action without ends, as we said. So no ends, just one thing, and keep them MVC, small changes.
Okay. Oh. All right, anything else on this topic? I have added a bunch of notes to the issue, so y'all can read and add any comments I may have missed.
I have one more thing. I added a plugin to my status bar on my desktop that basically displays the number of MRs over the last 30 days, the metric that we track. And it's been interesting. I mean, you can sort of, there are a couple of concerns around tracking that metric, I suppose, but seeing that it's kind of interesting. It's sort of a gamification of like, well, you need to ship another MR soon. Let's get something up. That's kind of interesting. I'm not sure if I keep that, but right now it's working.
You should share that for others to take a look at and maybe run themselves. I think it's a good idea, right? It keeps it always visible, keeps it top of mind. And I've heard it's okay to game the stats on MRs from Christopher. So makes you think about breaking it down, right?